Dr. Jeffrey A. Martin, thanks for being on Fitness and Consciousness.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. So, as we spoke for just a minute before we started recording, you asked me about my interest in this, and I was talking about how, I would read about these mystics or yogis from 1,000 years ago or however many years ago about their experiences through meditation, their transformations. And I always wondered what was real. And I've been on this path of my own path that includes all kinds of other paths, I guess, for most of my life. And so it was interesting to see your work where you're digging into the science of this and you're proving what people can really do now with scientifically. So I'm very excited to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I'm basically the guy you want to ask about that. Because I've traveled all around the world. We've basically gone across all of the world's major and minor spiritual traditions and religions, and philosophical systems and stuff like that. There's plenty of atheists and agnostics out there that experience this kind of stuff. And we've really researched the kind of stuff that you're talking about. Probably it's people who claimed to be in states of sort of so-called higher levels of consciousness, persistent higher levels of consciousness. So the public words for that are things like enlightenment or non-duality or persistent mystical states or God consciousness or unity consciousness or all kinds of stuff, even things like shamanic ecstasy and other things from sort of slightly more unusual traditions, than getting off sort of the beaten path there. And even I would say in ritual magic, like magical orders and things like that, where they have the Adeptus Major grade after the void, quote unquote. You go from being an Adeptus Minor to being an Adeptus Major, for instance, in some of these major magical traditions. And they cross the quote unquote void to get there. And very few people are able to successfully do that. Most people spend the rest of their career, so to speak, in the magical world inside of the Adeptus Minor degree and never cross over to the Adeptus Major degree, just like all of the people in various spiritual systems and religious systems and whatnot. Very few of them seem to actually transition to this. We call it, just as a bucket term for the public, we call it fundamental well-being. And for academics, we call it persistent non-symbolic experience, but I'll use fundamental well-being here today. So yeah, we can dig in. You ought to just ask me stuff that you've wondered about. And let's see if we've got data on it,
Yeah, well, the first thing was the name of it you just said, the persistent non-symbolic experience. So I guess the non-symbolic of it is the part that mostly sticks out to me. What do you mean by non-symbolic?
It's a really good question. And when we were first starting the research, we had a great deal of difficulty getting participants to work with us. And so within the academic world, we had issues with the sort of mainstream psychology branches and stuff like that, not really regarding this as a legitimate area of study because of some of the kind of anti-materialist claims that are made about it, sort of the more woo-woo claims that people make about this stuff. And they're like, that's not the kind of stuff that you can really study with science or whatnot. But it seemed to me like these people were, they were reporting on the whole a specific psychological state. They were saying that they, for instance, didn't have stress and anxiety and that they had high well-being and deep peace and things like that. And those are certainly all things that are measurable within the realm of psychology. So we had a little bit of a battle to fight on the academic side. And then in the public side, we had difficulty getting people to collaborate with us because they actually didn't believe that science could study them. And we made all kinds of mistakes when we first started out. Like I would call a participant and I would ask them if they'd participate in the research. And I learned that language was really particular to them. So, I might use the word consciousness and they're like, it's not about consciousness at all. It's all about experience. You don't have any idea what you're talking about. Or, the next time I might use experience and they'd be like, it has nothing to do with experience. It's all about consciousness or, whatever. It was like this damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of situation. And so what we started to do was really just try to find some sort of generic term that would resonate with everybody, but that would keep them on the phone, to continue the conversation and possibly participate in the research. And that came in the form of the phrase non-symbolically mediated consciousness, which comes from a Suzanne Cook-Greuter paper who did sort of a doctorate in this at the development school at Harvard. So she wrote this paper around 2000, and she had this little phrase in there, and I'm like, that's a really good phrase. And so the next time I called somebody, they were like, what do you study? And we're like, oh, well, we study persistent non-symbolic consciousness. And they kind of paused. And then they're like, okay, well, what can I do for you? And it was stuck with that term ever since. Eventually, we changed to persistent non-symbolic experience because more people liked that than the consciousness word. And so I would like to say that it's a word that we extracted after years of rigorous research or something like that. But it's actually a phrase that I just picked out of a paper that people kind of resonated with. Now, I think I know why they resonated with it, in hindsight. One of the things that happens is you get a much quieter mind. And, your mind is basically this heavy sort of symbol-driven system. It turns everything into a symbol. All the words, like I'm sitting on a chair right now, but to my mind, that chair is a symbol. And so when I think about the chair that I'm sitting on, it calls up the broad symbol category of a chair. And then it's a black chair, right? So it adds the black symbol to it. And then it's kind of got a mesh back. So it sort of adds that in, right? And it's not the real chair that is in my mind. It's like this made up conglomeration symbol thing that's in my mind about this chair. And so that's what our minds do, whether it's emotions or memories or thoughts. They're basically just these symbols that our minds are pushing around all the time and manipulating or being dragged along by or manipulated by in some cases, And so one of the things that happens with the shift to fundamental well-being is that there's a tremendous reduction. Sometimes it completely goes away. Other times it's just a lot less powerful than it was before in terms of your self-referential thinking or that sort of stream of thoughts in your head. And I often, give people a sense of what this is because people are sometimes like, well, what do you mean by a stream of thoughts in my head? And I say, well, you probably have like this voice in your head that, is kind of talking to you. And so, and lots of times it's not saying the nicest things. I will say, if you were to take that voice out of your head and transplant it into somebody that's in somebody else's body, would you really want to be stuck in an elevator with that person? Typically the answer is no, they don't want to be stuck in an elevator with that person. And so that's what I mean. It turns out a lot of our thoughts are actually self-referring thoughts. And so it's like, gosh, should I have worn a black shirt or a blue shirt or a white shirt to this interview? I hope he doesn't hate black. There's just like all these kind of random bullshit type thoughts that flow through our head. And those largely go away or become far less important at a minimum with non-symbolic or fundamental well-being, non-symbolic experience or fundamental well-being. And so I think that's really what resonated with people. They were like, persistent non-symbolic experience. Yeah, okay, I kind of see how that fits. And because it didn't have any baggage associated with it, they rolled with it.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking, because there's not, like, you see a symbol, and then people they start telling themselves a story about it, and they have a certain name. Well, in a different country from farther back, they have a different name, same symbol, but so then they have like arguments about like what it is. So when you're doing these studies, well, maybe it'd be a good idea to like kind of like backtrack a little bit to like, what is your background, like your science background, and because as we get into like what you, well, it's not the woo, but like what some people could think of as the woo, maybe it'd be good for people to understand where it is that you're coming from.
Absolutely, yeah. I've been an academic for about a dozen years or so. Prior to that, I did all kinds of different stuff. I was in TV many years ago. I did like sports broadcasting and stuff like that. Even religious broadcasting. I started out actually in religious broadcasting. My mom was a Christian TV show host. She had a big show that was syndicated all over the world about missionaries. Wow. And so that's kind of how I slid my way into TV. And I went from TV to advertising to computers were mixed in there, built my own businesses and stuff. And right around a dozen years ago or so, I was, um, quite successful, but I didn't feel like I was as happy as I could be. I wasn't miserable or unhappy or depressed or something like that, but it just seemed like there were people who were working a lot less than I was, who were happier than I was. That didn't necessarily seem fair. And so I really sort of just quit everything that I was doing, and I went back to school. I picked up psychology and neuroscience education from Harvard on the East Coast, and then um, really a qualitative research education from what I think is the best school for qualitative research, and I picked up a PhD from there on which is CIS, California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. And so I kind of feel like I tried to get the best quantitative and qualitative research training that I possibly could, because I was trying to tackle a problem that I thought would require both of them. And schools typically specialize in one or the other. Like most universities are very quantitative in their approach, sort of like Harvard is. But the qualitative stuff adds in a lot of the flavor. You miss a lot of the meaning if you're only crunching numbers and stuff like that, and that flavor is extremely important to understand things. And so I knew we needed a mixed method type design between these two things. So I tried to get the best of both worlds from an education standpoint. And then, really started with trying to figure out who the happiest people were out there to see if I could join them. I'd taken every course and, I'd just done everything that you could possibly do over decades. And it had worked, like I said, I wasn't unhappy, but it hadn't really got me to that last mile. I didn't really know even what that last mile was at that point. And so that's the perspective basically that I come from. And then I looked at these different populations of people who seemed to be very happy, and sort of systematically narrowed down the one that I thought would be the best to research. And when I started researching these people, I frankly thought that they would be crazy, that we'd find psychopathology associated with them, given some of their claims and things like that. I mean, they really talk about, losing the self, for instance, and, they have all of these sort of strange things that they talk about. And to a Western psychologist, these things sound nuts. They sound like actually a disorder. They sound like depersonalization, derealization disorder, which, your listeners and viewers can Google. The problem is that for that disorder, you're really bad off. Like you're super depressed, you're suicidal, all of that. And these people were claiming to be like the happiest folks out there. And so they had like kind of the description of it, but not the impact that it normally had. And that was really confusing. So here we are, all these years later, and we've had an amazingly successful run, really, all around the world. Because I had success in business prior to this, I was able to mostly fund it myself, and that allowed the study to take place. I think that one of the primary reasons that the study couldn't happen before was there was just no money for it. It's not something that like the NIH or the government or some school is going to fund. Because it wasn't, it was considered kind of this fringe area when we first started. It's a lot less so now. And the other side is that I really think we came along at the right time, because global communications and global travel and whatnot, thanks to the internet, basically I could reach anyone, anywhere, and set up interviews and then go interview them in person, which we always did all of our interviews in person. And so I traveled all around the world. Talked to all sorts of people, interviewed all sorts of people about this, gave them all sorts of gold standard psychological measures, did lots of physiological measurement of things like heart rate and brain waves, and this something called GSR, which is sort of your skin electrical resistance, which is an indicator of stress and focus and things like that. And so all sorts of different methods to try to sort of get our arms around who these people were and are. And so we've had a really fortunate and blessed run, it's worked for me. I'm one of them now. A couple of years ago, I kept myself away from it for a long time because I didn't want to bias the research. And I felt like if I transitioned into it too early in the research, that I couldn't really believe the findings. It would sort of be like listening to somebody who drank the Kool-Aid and then generated the data. And so I waited till the bulk of the data was generated and then transitioned over myself. And I mean, it's an incredible difference.
Yeah. So were the people that you were talking about that seemed to be the happiest, was it a particular like tribe or from a particular region, or these are people all over the place?
These are people from all over the place. And, there are people who are basically representing one of a couple of things. Either that they've had a very successful transition in their own religious or spiritual system to its more mystical side. Of course, if it's Buddhism or Hinduism or something, that's the goal in general. But if it's Christianity or Islam or Judaism or something, you know, the mysticism stuff and the Abrahamic traditions is basically pushed to the corners. You don't get a lot of that stuff. I mean, good luck getting on mainstream Christian TV if you're planning on talking mysticism. That's just never going to happen, right? Yeah. So you can get there if you're healing people in the name of Jesus or whatever, right? But if you start talking about mystical union with Christ and whatever else, it's like those invitations are never going to come, right? But there's this whole universe in each one of these religions out there of all of these mystics and people trying to become mystics and all of that. You just got to go find them. So it was those people, but also eventually, you know, we got to normal people as well. And there are plenty of atheists and agnostics that have also experienced this psychological shift. Usually one of the early questions that I get in an interview is, what is the shift really? Is there a core to this shift? And there really is. Traditionally, most people feel like there is something that is just not quite right. Right? And so if you look down to sort of the deepest level of your psychology, what you find there is basically a sense that something just isn't quite right. And it's where we get all of our goals from, right? Because, I mean, you know, we listen to the voice in our head and we're like, oh, if I just had that Ferrari, or if I just had a daughter instead of a son, or if I just had a different partner or a different job, or, I mean, you know, name the endless stream of things that could in some way fix this, right? That flow through everybody's head all the time. If I could just have, it's the entire basis of the modern advertising, you know, culture, right? Yeah. If I could just have X, then, you know, I would finally be satisfied, right? That itch, that deep itch that something is just fundamentally not quite right would finally be scratched. But that's actually a sort of a misunderstanding of our overall nervous system and psychology, because it's really an ancient part of us that has that. And it makes a lot of sense. For most of humans' lives, you know, we were not at the top of the food chain. You know, we could get our arm ripped off by some tiger, or we get a little cut while we're walking through blades of grass and it gets infected and we die. And, you know, I mean, 100,000 years ago, we were in a really different spot than we are right now. And the reality is the genome is fairly slow to catch up. Although you get these punctuated changes like around 10, 12,000 years ago for farming, or more recently with the scientific revolution and stuff like that, the reality is that the bulk of our genome remains relatively unchanged. And so we're wired for an existence that is pretty ancient and doesn't have much to do with modern reality. And that's one of the reasons why when your boss says you're fired and you're never going to work in this industry again, or your spouse comes home and is like, I'm leaving you, or whatever else, it feels like a tiger is ripping your arm off. You know, it feels like you're dying, right? When in fact, that's insane. There's a zillion jobs and careers out there. There's like billions of potential partners out there. I mean, there's no reason for you to feel that way. But what's happening is this old part of your nervous system is sort of being mapped onto modern reality, because that's all it's got. And you can't really turn that old part of your nervous system off. So you're sort of stuck with these, you know, kind of extreme reactions to things internally that produce a lot of psychological suffering for us, especially in these sorts of extreme examples. And so it makes a lot of sense that we used to, you know, that we were wired like this. And thank God we were wired like this. And probably if we were living in a tribe in the Brazilian rainforest or something, we'd still want to be wired like this. But, you know, I mean, I live in Silicon Valley, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine a safer place than Silicon Valley. Half the time we don't even lock our doors around here. It's one of the richest places in the world. Like realistically, I am not worried about somebody bursting in here and killing me, or a wild animal ripping my arm off in the backyard, or starving before I make it to the next berry bush, you know, and hoarding food. Or so if anything, I'm trying to lose weight, right? And so it's like we're wired for the exact opposite environment that we basically find ourselves living in a modern Western lifestyle. And what seems to happen with this change is it's almost like nature is phasing in an upgrade. It's like nature is phasing in something that matches much more much more correctly this modern lifestyle that we all find ourselves in. And so instead of having that persistent nagging feeling that you've got to constantly be on guard or that something isn't quite right, instead what you have that replaced by is a sense that, pretty much things are just fine, as they are. And if you think about your life, kind of no matter what's going on, pretty much things are just fine. I mean, unless you're in a war zone and there's bombs dropping on the houses around you or some extreme like that, kind of no matter what your problems are, pretty much things are fine, right? I mean, you could have some advanced form of cancer or something, and that's not fine. I mean, there are exceptions to this, right? But for the vast majority of us, things are basically okay. Even when they're really bad, they're still pretty much okay. And so that's a fundamental change at the baseline of people's psychology that happen. So that experience fundamental well-being. And then because of the way the brain works, and it just kind of layers one thing on top of another, with that as your baseline, it leads to such a fundamentally different experience and just such a fundamentally more positive experience of your day-to-day life and the day-to-day moment-to-moment events in your life. Because instead of coming from like I know something is wrong here, sort of deep down perspective, you're like, yeah, everything is fine. This is great. Life is great. Not in a non-functional way. You're still very functional. I mean, if you pulled a gun on me, I'd be able to handle it. But it's a really significant change in how one lives one's life. And it really, to me, just seems like nature's upgrade to modern life for humans,
Yeah, it's interesting that you put it like that, because you may know I'm a strength and conditioning instructor, so I work at a gym. I'm actually opening my own gym in just about a week and a half.
Great, congratulations.
Couple weeks away. Yeah, it's really cool. But I also have what I call my job, where I work at a factory. I work from 5 a.m. until 1 p.m, and then I see my clients in the afternoons and evenings at the gym. And so most of my friends are they're into yoga, they're into fitness, they're into this kind of world. And then so that's like the environment that I'm in. And then when I'm at my job at the factory, and it's mostly like cool people also, but just for a little contrast, I noticed that like some people will get mad over stuff where I'm like, I'm fine, it's not a big deal. But they'll get a couple of them, like one guy in particular today, he's getting like really mad about like the shift that, the second shift guys, did something, and he's like so mad. And I'm like, it's not a big deal. Like what, just like, where's all this anger coming from? Like, why are you so mad? And I'm like kind of mellow, and I hear people like complaining about stuff. And sometimes it's almost like they're on like the majority of what they say is some kind of complaint. Like it's, I mean, they have their good moments too. I don't just mean to like talk bad, but it's an interesting thing where I have like this one world where everybody is just like pretty much like happy and doing and have meaning, and they're doing these awesome things, and they have their own businesses, and they have these cool things happening. And then this other thing that's like, they're getting mad over nothing, and so I was thinking about that today. So it was interesting that you brought it up. Like their response is if like that tiger is coming to get them, or that the big bad guy from the other village is coming to get him, or but like what you were saying is like, since we don't really have those kind of things to really be worried about now, at least some of us are taken off to this next level. And I try not to get like too preachy when I see the guys like complaining about nothing. I don't want to be just like, if you were only as enlightened as me, I mean, I might have.
Yeah, that always works, too. Right?
What'd you say?
I said that always works, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
You're totally gonna win a moment with that.
My stuff too. I'm not trying to be like I'm better than them or anything like that. It's just like this thing that I notice. But like, I guess like what's the common thread in those people that are able to be happy and have like meaningful lives. And like, what do you think that people are that are still reacting as if uh, they're getting mad over nothing and they're complaining all the time? Like, what's the difference? And like,
That's a great question. And, from a neuroscience standpoint, the difference is how their brains are wired or been rewired. I mean, I don't know about you. You've been meditating for a long time. You've been doing this stuff for a long time. But I sure remember being like those guys at the factory. And so, for me, it wasn't really that long ago when I was, like that. And I was wired just like everybody else was. That is really normal human wiring, essentially, that you're looking at from that side of the fence, right? And then you have this other, it's fascinating that you're living in both these worlds, right? Because then you have this other side of your life where people have found these various tools and methods and perspectives, and they've clearly done a lot of rewiring, essentially, in their brain. I think if you were to go quiz those other people, in your yoga fitness side of your life, and you were to say, hey, do you remember when you were like this? Probably they would all be like, yeah, sure, I remember, when I was like that. That's why I do this now. I don't want to go back to being like that. I don't want to lead some angry, pissed off for no reason, even though it seemed like you were totally justified in why you were angry, or, whatever type of existence. And that's what a lot of these methods do and produce. And as people work on themselves, I think it's interesting. There's really, like, if you want to think of it, almost like three categories here, right? So one category would be your fellow workers at the factory. And then there's two other categories that some people in the yoga fitness side of your life will be in. And another, some will be in one category, some will be in another category. Of the three, right? I mean, some of them are probably new and they might get angry about, whatever, too. I mean, we're overgeneralizing things. Certainly people can wander into a gym or something and, be normal. But, just to sort of jump off of what you were talking about. So, like, I had gone through a lot of programs, a lot of self-help programs, done a lot of work on myself, done plenty of meditation and different forms of spiritual practices and stuff over the years. Decades and decades, really, of that stuff, trying to just increase my overall well-being and reduce my reactionary nature and all that. And that had worked really well, up to the point where I had started this research. And so, like, we have people that just before their transition to fundamental well-being, if you ask them, hey, how happy do you think you are? They're like, I am super happy. I'm not reactionary. I'm not. And so you can absolutely be in sort of like, let's just call it the second category. You can like absolutely be in sort of like the second category of people who have found stuff, done a lot of work on their own, and have really made themselves a lot less reactionary and a lot happier. But the interesting thing about fundamental well-being is it's this mystery third category. And there traditionally haven't been a lot of reliable ways to get to it. And so, like, people could practice meditation. They could even be dedicated to like some form of Buddhism or Hinduism or something like that. And they could practice that stuff for decades and, make it all the way into their life, die, never have actually made it to fundamental well-being. They would have gotten a lot of the benefits in the second category, right? They would have definitely reduced their reactionary nature, made them happier, all of that kinds of stuff. But they wouldn't have sort of like turned the corner in terms of that sort of really deep down page, in their book, from that they would still have, if you were to ask them, a sense that something was still not quite right, Whereas if you talk to people in the third category, they feel like things are fine, irregardless really of what's going on. That's not to say that they won't have emotions come up if their spouse leaves them. They might be in a place in fundamental well-being where that doesn't bother them at all. Or they might be in a place in fundamental well-being, a different type of them, where they have all kinds of emotion come up around that, but they can still look down deeper. And fundamentally, they're like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, I shouldn't be feeling like everything is fine in this situation, but
Mhm.
somehow it just sort of seems like everything is fine, even though I've got these emotions, these negative emotions about the situation, or mixed emotions. Maybe they're excited their spouse is leaving, who knows, could go either way. um, you know so there are these, but there's this third category that is something different. It is its own thing. It's like this other bonus level to reality that most people never really make it to. And most people never even really find out about. And so it can look similar to somebody who's really done a lot of the level 2 stuff or the category 2 stuff. But there's a huge difference to it. That person that just before fundamental well-being is like, I'm as happy as you could possibly be as a human being. After fundamental well-being, is sitting there kind of, and they've actually had them say this to us, is sitting there kind of saying, I have no idea how to even explain it. How do you explain like a happiness and a contentment and a well-being and a peace and whatever beyond what you formerly would have considered and what the world would have formerly considered like as much happiness as you thought you could ever possibly have? And so it's like even confusing for people to try to explain. But it's definitely worth making it to, because it brings it, the thing that it brings with it that you just don't get otherwise is that sense of peace. Everybody is really looking for that sense of peace in all the wrong places. And back when I was in the advertising industry, we were really good at convincing people that they were going to find that peace in a car or some new Pop-Tart or whatever it is that we were selling. And we would successfully get people to go from car to car to car to Pop-Tart to Pop-Tart to Pop-Tart or whatever, right? But even though there was like a momentary satisfaction, in the car or whatever, it never lasts, right? That there is never that sort of deep, for no reason other than the fact that you exist, peace, sense that everything is okay, sense of wholeness, sense that you don't need to add anything to yourself, sense that you don't need to, there's nothing that you need to become better or a better person, or there's nothing that's sort of missing. You have sort of this fundamental sense of contentment. Doesn't mean you can't be effective at work or whatever. But it just, your motivations are coming from a different place. They're not coming from as neurotic a place and whatnot as they did before. But it is kind of hard to explain to people.
Yeah, I'm still willing to give the Ferrari a chance I'm still willing to like try that part of my consciousness. No, when you were saying,
yeah, I would go with Ferrari over Lamborghini. I can tell you they're a lot more comfortable.
yeah, I haven't driven either one, but hopefully I'll get there. But when you were talking, it reminded me of like, do you know who Ram Dass is?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I'm not really into like gurus and stuff, but I love Ram Dass. He's so cool. I love the way he talks, and he just makes a lot of
He was
sense
a
to me.
Harvard psychologist, right? So he
Yeah.
was a Richard Alpert, who's
Yeah.
a psych professor at Harvard back in Leary's day and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So I remember in one of his books, he was talking about how he went to, I forget the name of the town in India, where basically people just go to die. So it's a bunch of old people, they got diseases, they're about to die. And so he goes there. He's a healthy guy. He's
Right.
just there to check it out. Or maybe he knew somebody that was dying. I forget why he was there, but he goes there and he sees like all this misery. But it was mainly just in his mind. He's like, they seem to be fine. And they were looking at him like, oh, poor guy. Like, they're all there suffering horribly in his mind. But in their mind, he's the one that's like kind of pitiful. Like, is there,
Yeah.
is this the kind of thing that you're talking about? And
Kind of it is. Yeah. You do sort of, look at ordinary people when you're in this place and you feel bad for them. Your heart goes out to them because you remember how shitty life was, even when you thought it was like awesome. But by comparison, it's like, oh man, there's like so much suffering, even in the best parts of normal life, Yeah, I don't miss any of that. And so that, that it does, your heart really goes out to people. It really, really does.
And so what's the techniques? So you're talking about the level 1 category is like the being reactive and you get mad easy. Level 2 is like you're getting beyond that, you're less reactive, and then there's this next level that people that's seems to be much harder to obtain or less often attained anyways.
Yeah.
Like how do you make the jump from 2 to 3?
It's a really good question. And traditionally, it's been regarded as extremely difficult. People would go away on meditation retreats and like nobody makes the jump. Or maybe if they're lucky, one person makes the jump or something. It's probably like that guy's 10th meditation retreat. It's either their first one and they've never done anything like it before, right? Or they've done a whole bunch of them. It seems like it's like one or the other. Either they're just luck into it, basically. They have no idea why they're there. They're there with a friend. They're just like following along. They don't have all these concepts keeping them from it, And so they, of course, are the one that transitions, and then everybody else is like hating them, right? Because they've just done all this meditation for forever. Or, somebody finally has luck with it after X amount of years or whatever. And so it's funny because it's really been regarded as super, super difficult. And so we kept hearing that. I didn't have a frame of reference for this in the early days of the research, but I picked up that ethos, that like this was like a hard thing. And there were zillions of books about it, that, which is pretty indicative of when it's a hard thing. Like, there's a lot of books about how to do really hard sports things and, and stuff like that, right? You don't need that many books if something's easy, right? And so I assumed that this was a really hard thing too. And eventually we entered a second phase of the research when I wanted to be able to study people before and after it. And by this point, we'd gone all over, we'd researched tons of people. We knew all kinds of methods. And I hadn't really seen a method that seemed to be reliable in transitioning people. I mean, if you're going to run people through neuroscience experiments and you're going to spend like $3,000 to $5,000 on each one of those people, like you can't afford to have a lot of misses. Like you can't have people who like start doing it, but then don't get anywhere. So you don't get the after data. You just get the before data. Like that's a recipe for disaster in the research world. And so it was a real problem that no matter how hard I looked and no matter how many people I asked, we never found, sort of a reliable method. And what that led us to do was basically have to invent our own protocol for this. And I think we did it the way any normal person would actually think about doing it. We basically had all of these people who were part of our research, and we asked them what worked for them. And then we analyzed their answers and, basically sorted on what worked the most and then used that. Right? I mean, it's not like it's some super fancy idea, right? I mean, like it's just common sense. Like who the hell would have done it any other way, right? But we just had this giant population of people that enabled us to really go across cultures and, all of that. And so we were able to basically come up with, it's just under about 30 different things that we had people try. And so we put together this protocol, and we have people go through it. And it's essentially trial and error. We have tried so hard to try to find some sort of survey that I could give you or something that would like match you up to your ideal thing. And if there is like one major thing that we have failed at in our research, that's it. So you still basically, all we can do is basically have you go through all of these different things that are, at least we sorted out the best ones from around the world, right? And then we experimented a lot with putting them in an order and seeing if like there was a specific order that worked better than another order. And, and then we sort of combined some and, we modified them a little bit to be slightly more effective here and there. And so like, at least you're getting like a souped up version of it, right? But you do still literally have to go through every single one of them until you find the one that works for you. And, maybe like in the very first week, the very first thing you learn will just be the thing that matches up to you and you'll get lucky and you'll transition in the first week. That happens. If 100 people go through the protocol and go through the experiment, there's probably, 3, 4, 5, something like that out of 100 people that'll transition right in the very first week, in the first few days even. Because the name of the game is really, it turns out that what people couldn't see when they were stuck in their own silos of these different religious and spiritual systems is that the name of the game is about finding a method that works for you. Right. And so you want to basically have a collection of methods that you know work really well, but that's not enough. There's some sort of matching, even though we haven't quite figured out what it is yet. There's some sort of matching that goes on between you and your psychology. And it's just like a key in a lock, you know, it's like, you know, you keep fumbling with all these different keys, but then once you get the right key, it's not like it takes you a year and a half to turn the lock. Like the lock just turns. And so it's really that simple. So what we basically came up with for our experiments was this protocol that just ran people through in a very specific order. And it's, from our back end, it's quite complicated, the protocol. It's like a really kind of sophisticated cocktail from a psychological, cognitive science, neuroscience sort of standpoint. But from the person going through it, we're just like, do this now for a week. And then they do it, right? It's totally simple from that side of the fence. And so it's all experiential. There's not theory, and you're not like, oh, here's what it is, or here's what it isn't, and here, blah, 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 and avoid this, and don't eat any meat, and don't have any sex, and, you know, wear purple clothes, or, you know, it doesn't have anything to do with any of that. It's just about systematically going through these things until you find the thing that is the key in your lock. So I actually have a completely different view of this than practically everybody else on the planet. You know, everybody else that's out there thinks this is like some super hard thing to transition to. And we do this, we routinely transition people to this in our experiments. And so now for me, the hard part is not the transition part, but it's helping people adjust to it on the other side, because now you have this very different way of being in the world, right? You're at peace. Your own life history is really not that important to you. Like, you know, for the average person, like their life story matters a lot. You know, you meet somebody and you're like, tell me about yourself, you know, and you get like this really long, detailed thing of all the things that they think makes them, you know, important that you should know about. And that forms their identity of who they are. You know, you meet somebody in fundamental well-being and you're like, tell me about yourself. And they're more likely to be like, oh, you know, I don't know, tell me about you. Because it's like that accumulated story, it's just not that important anymore. You know, it's just like this made up fairy tale for the most part anyway. We don't like to think about that, but we even know this in neuroscience. You know, in neuroscience, memories are very volatile. We call them volatile. And there's this process called hippocampal re-encoding and other processes in the brain. And what all that basically means is that when you call up a memory and you're experiencing the memory, it's not like a picture in a photo book. Like you're restoring the memory while you're experiencing it, right? And so the more you call up a memory, the more you're changing your memories and the less accurate those memories are getting. So the more a memory comes to mind, essentially the less accurate that memory is going to be over time. And of course, it probably wasn't all that accurate in the first place because there's just so much data that we don't store in memory about any given situation because there's only so much space up here, right? And so, you know, from the perspective of someone in fundamental well-being, that you know, it's almost like that's an obvious thing. And so you don't take these stories, you don't take these memories and whatnot nearly as serious as the other person, but you're still living in the normal world, right? And so you're still talking to your friends. And for most human interaction, it's like, I tell you my stories and you validate them in some way. You know, you'll be like, oh man, that sucks. Oh, that person, I can't believe they did that to you. That's so terrible, right? Or maybe you're like, oh, that's awesome. I'm so excited for you. Congratulations. But it's a validation game, right? Like I tell you my stories, you validate them. Then you tell me your stories and I validate yours. And that's what makes a friendship kind of, right? Well, from a standpoint of fundamental well-being, when you don't care about those stories anymore, and you don't really care about whether or not anybody else validates you because you already feel whole and complete, and like, I don't need your approval. I'm not, you know, going to have dinner with you so that I can tell you my stories and hope to get some approval from you. But I'm like happy, right? You know, like I don't need your approval to be happy. Your approval isn't going to add anything to my life, really. And so it's a very different way of experiencing the world and a lot of things like this. And so the hard part of our research has really come down to helping people integrate with it and helping people to understand, hey, you know, listen, maybe don't tell your spouse about this right away, right? Because you don't want your spouse to be like, what do you mean, you're experiencing X, Y, or that sounds weird. We should take you to the doctor. Or, they may not understand what happened to you because they're still living from sort of a normal person's perspective. And you remember a normal person's perspective, so you can interface with them, you can fake it, you can pretend. So lots of times we tell people to do things like that. We're like, let this settle in. You're going to want to run out and tell everybody about it because it feels amazing, and everybody should be experiencing it, and it's the thing that every human is actually trying to reach but doesn't have any idea exists, and all of that. Yes, 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 yes. But maybe keep it to yourself for a little bit, initially, because your friends are going to think you're kind of strange, and your spouse is going to think you're kind of strange. And so there's this big integration piece that goes along with this as well. You really are, you're living in the same world as everybody else, but you're living in a different world than everybody else. And it's also the case that people don't like other people to be that happy, frankly. There's a lot of jealousy. If you really let on like how much you're enjoying your life now and how little things are bothering you and whatever else, there's a big like pull them down kind of game that goes on out there among sort of normal folks. And so there's just all kinds of landmines like that. So ironically, we don't think it's that hard to transition people, but there are like these important things to just sort of keep in mind that we're learning about on the other side to help people really integrate this in. And because nobody's in the past, people haven't transitioned people in these large numbers like we have. So they haven't really had this problem. They might have like 1 or 2 or 10 or something students over a lifetime that transition. And they might have to kind of advise them a little bit on the side. But when you've got like large numbers of people that are transitioning, this becomes something that you kind of have to ethically deal with,
Yeah, that it reminded me of, I had a guest on, and she's a psychotherapist. She lives in Costa Rica, and she hosts ayahuasca retreats. And she's not the shaman, but she, works with the shaman. The people like stay at her house and eat there and everything. And then they go to the shaman. Well, the shaman isn't very good at, he's good at the shaman stuff, the ayahuasca, that thing. But as far as like understanding the Western mind and then what to do with that experience, he doesn't really connect very good that way. So yeah, people that are like, they wear the khaki pants and the polo shirt to work, and then they go to see the shaman, and they're like, what am I wearing? What am I doing? Why am I
yeah, totally.
And they don't have any way to, so she helps them kind of use that. So it's interesting that you're saying like the same kind of thing.
That's a super important role that she plays.
Yeah. And so these different things that you're doing, like, does any of it involve the people that were doing ayahuasca? I remember reading about something about shamans on your website. I think as part of like the second, what was it? Can't remember. The second awakening, the fourth awakening. Like there was like the first awakening, like humans, and like the second awakening was like the shamans, and then we're in the fourth now. I might have that a little bit wrong. Sorry if I'm just going by memory.
Good enough. More than good enough.
But what was I saying? Oh, so I don't know if I have like a specific question, but I guess do you get into that, like the ayahuasca experience? Were those part of your studies? And or are you compare like people that they're doing like Zen meditation or this type of yoga or transcendental meditation? Are you looking at like these specific things or
all kinds of stuff like that? Yeah, there are people transitioned from very few people transition from psychedelics. And we get a lot of people that come into our research program who want to have a persistent experience. They've taken drugs and drugs and drugs and drugs and drugs, and they're chasing what they hope someday will be a persistence. And eventually they kind of give up, and then they start meditating and they start trying other methods. Ram Dass, who you mentioned earlier, Richard Alpert, there's classic story, right?
Yeah.
It's his life story, basically. And so that's super, super common. So we get a lot of people in the program that have had peak experiences through drugs or near-death experiences or other stuff, and who are looking to try to get to a persistence level of that amazing form of experience and well-being and whatnot. And we help them out with that. But in terms of like actually transitioning to it, and the first part of the study when we were going around and sort of getting our arms around this and interviewing people who claimed to experience this, very, very, really there was nobody in the first sample of 1,200 people who said that they transitioned from drug use, from psychedelics. And that really stood out for me. There was also nobody who transitioned from yoga, from physical yoga postures and stuff like that. I thought that was very interesting. There was one guy who did have a transition in the middle of his morning yoga practice, but he was more attributing his transition to another practice called direct inquiry, where you're sort of asking yourself, who am I, and stuff like that. And so there were some kind of surprises like that, because you would have thought that like out of that big a sample of people, somebody would have transitioned from drugs. But we didn't see it, not in that group. Since then, I've had some people say that that was true for them, but it's pretty unusual. It seems like, they give you a peak temporary experience, but they don't really give you a persistent experience. And so beyond that, it's people who try to get there, all kinds of different types of meditation and, cognitive interventions and stuff like that. A surprising number of people get there from attempted suicide and from suicidal ideation.
Cool.
And in fact, there's even a famous teacher named Eckhart Tolle, a famous spiritual teacher. And that's kind of his story. He was like, the razor blade was like right at his wrist or whatever. And then poof, he transitioned into, fundamental well-being. And so, we should be clear, if there's anybody listening to this that has suicidal ideation, you should get professional help. The act of suicide is not a good escape. There's a tiny percentage of people who are lucky like Eckhart Tolle. But they do exist. And I think so many people are suicidally depressed that may actually be one of the main ways that people transition to fundamental well-being, because so few people transition anyway to it. And then some people get there just who knows why, they're like walking down the street and like their brain just rewires and it just sort of happens. And some people have never been any other way. So there are some people that from right around age 3 is when sort of your normal sense of self starts to develop. And there are some people that just never had that happen. Somehow they just skipped that whole process and they wound up in fundamental well-being their entire life instead of experiencing sort of that other way. And so that was kind of fascinating. And I think there's a lot of people actually who experience this. And maybe, this is kind of, you can kind of quiz yourself, see if this relates to you. So like there's different types of this, right? And we have what we call a continuum of experiences. And so we think that, we think of fundamental well-being as there's a bunch of different types of it, but they're all related to each other. It's all sort of a related continuum of experiences. And if you think of continuum like a number line, you kind of can have different numbers on there. And we call those locations along the continuum, just like you can have a location on a number line. Like there can be the number 2 in between 1 and 3 on a number line, right? And so location 1 is really sort of at the furthest, I don't want to say lowest, because I think any form of fundamental well-being is an awesome form of fundamental well-being to be in, right? But it's maybe like the earliest form of fundamental well-being or the lowest form of fundamental well-being or whatever else. But we don't like value judgments like that. It's hard to talk about these things and not use language like this. But again, I mean, like wherever you land, whatever you've got going on in fundamental well-being, like just be grateful, right? Because any fundamental well-being is good fundamental well-being compared to normal psychological, health, quote unquote. And so in location 1, I have a lot of normal friends, right, from earlier parts of my life when I was doing other stuff, working in TV, which is frankly not that different than working in a factory. It's basically a trade that you learn. Some people go to college for it, some people did, and I didn't. And it's you're loading trucks and unloading trucks and setting up a production environment, and then you're running some piece of equipment, and then you're packing it all up into a semi and you're moving on to the next place, right? Mm-hmm. And so I've got a wide variety of people in my life, from the computer years, from TV years, from advertising years, from business years, from whatever. And I was having dinner the other night with an old friend of mine from computer years. And I just realized he was probably in fundamental well-being. And so it makes me think, I should talk a little bit about maybe what that's like. And, because I think he had no clue it existed. He had no clue he experienced life that way. He knew it was like he was experiencing life differently than like his wife and his friends and his mom and, you know, his coworkers and all of that. And these days he's a big time guy. He's basically the head of information security for a huge multinational company. Like he's got one of those dream jobs and lives that, you know, people try to have. And so, but despite that, despite all he'd read and learned, and he's big into self-help and all that, he had no idea. He had no idea until we talked about it. And so one of the things in location one, basically, generally speaking, you've had some sort of shift, and often people just don't even recognize the shift, or they don't recognize the shift right away, even if they're looking for it. Even if they're in a place like Fairfield, Iowa, the headquarters of TM in America, Transcendental Meditation in America, I've had people there tell me that they didn't realize that they'd had their shift for months. And that's all they do is sit around and talk about this. Right? I mean, it's like if you could be in an environment like that and not realize it, then that's kind of incredible. So in location one, generally you've had some sort of shift. And that shift, the first thing to notice is that really when you look down to the deepest, most basic level of your psychology, of your psychological experience of the world, of your subjective experience of the world, it's that fundamental sense that everything feels okay, right? Again, there might be a lot of emotionality stacked on top of that. You know, there might be all kinds of crap going on in your life that doesn't feel okay, but somehow deep down, things are still kind of okay, even though it doesn't necessarily make sense given all the crap you got going on in life right now or whatever, right? Or maybe you got a great life and there's not a lot of crap, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. So there's that fundamental shift, and that really is the thing that denotes whether or not someone is on the continuum or not. But that doesn't mean that you can't be triggered. That doesn't mean that you can't get angry. That doesn't mean that you don't still have a whole bunch of psychological conditioning that's been built up in your system over years and programmed into you, all kinds of reactions and whatever else. You can still absolutely be reactionary. What you notice is that it falls off a lot faster than it used to, right? So, you know, somebody cuts you off in traffic, and, you know, you might still flip them off and have some choice words for them, but you're probably not following them on their bumper, you know, like 4 miles later, you know, pointing to the gun rack behind you or whatever, right? Like you maybe did before, right? And so that's a great example. And in fact, almost everybody uses the example of being cut off in traffic. It's like the universal thing that everybody has been through and noticed. Mm-hmm. That's why I like to use it as an example. I heard it so many times during participant interviews. Mm-hmm. And so realistically, you can still have these reactionary moments, right? Your wife can still piss you off. Your husband can still piss you off. Your kids can still piss you off. Your coworkers can still piss you off. But it falls off a lot more rapidly than it ever did in the past. It's sort of like, you know, blip, done, over. And you're just like back at that point to sort of, you know, more of an okay place of well-being. It's got to be something really heavy for it to last longer than that. You know, something like your mom pushing your buttons, you know, something that's programmed in deep, you know, maybe some religious or spiritual thing that you were programmed in with from a zillion years ago, you know, and so your spouse can definitely know where the hardcore hot buttons are, you know, as well. And so, I mean, it's not that there aren't things that can't piss you off for days, that can have like a long trail off, because there are, but they're extreme things, you know. They're not the normal things that would have pissed you off and kept you angry and made you bitter and put that person on your enemies list, you know, because they left your coffee cup out, or, you know, whatever trivial thing it was, anymore. And so that's a big change in people's lives, is that emotional reactivity falling off like that. You also typically have had a quieting of that self-referential thought stream. And even if it doesn't feel like for most people, it feels like there's fewer thoughts. Like it just feels like their head is kind of emptier than it was before. And it's not that like they're not as smart as they were before, or it's just like there's just less chatter and less sort of garbage crap going on up there than there was before. And so it actually makes the mind a lot more powerful, because you've got a lot more capacity up there to use. There's like a lot more spare cycles waiting for you to actually do something useful with them instead of worrying about, whether whatever, some BS. And so, but even if it doesn't, even if those thoughts don't quiet down, one thing that will happen is that the thoughts will be a lot less important, right? And so like right now, there's like some fan running in the background here, like the climate controls on or something. And I mean, I can hear it. And if I want to stop and focus on it, yeah, I can stop and focus on it, and I can get really detailed with it. But mostly I'm just ignoring it. Like it's just sort of there. It's coming and going. It's getting turned on, getting turned off, but I'm paying attention to our conversation, right? My attention is somewhere else. And so these thought streams, especially the negative thought streams, it used to just like yank you in and take you along for a ride, sometimes for long periods of time. They just don't do that anymore. They might still be able to grab you, but a lot quicker you're able to be like, whoa, hold on, and then you're back to a different place. Where you're not being sort of tugged along and pulled along by these thought streams and stuff like that anymore. And so even if you still have a bunch of like that internal self narrative, it's lost its power. It's lost a lot of its power over you. And that's a profound change in your moment-to-moment well-being. And so these types of things, they're the types of things that happen to someone who transitions to fundamental well-being. And I think there are a lot more people that experience this and don't really have a word for it. Don't necessarily even reflect on their own internal experience enough to realize that these changes have actually happened. And but if they could, that'd be great, because you could, once you realize, oh, wait a minute, no, I'm experiencing things that's not normal. Like other people are still, tailgating the guy for 6 blocks, and getting the gun off their rack and, whatever else, right? And so if you realize, oh, no, wait, I'm in this different place, then you can use some of our integration stuff. Then you can, you're in a place where you can take advantage of our knowledge of the cycles that unfold for this. There's like a 2-year cycle right after transition. There's these 7-year cycles that unfold after it that all deal with sort of this mental house cleaning process that just kind of automatedly kicks off and, just sort of goes on its own. But you can shape it, you can help it a little bit, you can optimize it in different ways. There's just all sorts of stuff that I think is beneficial to know about this. And people also make a lot more sense to you, when you realize that you've had sort of this transition. And that you're just, you're no longer sort of like them. You don't really realize how different you've become to them. And it's helpful. It's helpful to realize that you're privileging peace now, probably more than other things, whereas before you had this neurotic drive that would drive you to go get whatever it was that your mind told you had to go get rid of the discontentment. And, this time, right? It's told you a million things in the past. It'll tell you a million things in the future. It's never going to get rid of that discontentment, no matter how many goals you chase down. But now you're in a different place. You're sort of privileging peace, if you will. And so you're really kind of making trade-offs around like, how much do I really want to engage at work, or how much, and with people at work and their stories, or my friends' stories, or, how much do I want to engage with this, that, or the other thing? Because every time I engage in that other world, I've got a little scale that's tipping in my mind, right? And right now, this is the fundamental well-being networks in my brain, and they're firing strong, right? Mm-hmm. But if I want to start interfacing with the rest of the world, I need those old networks that kind of suck and that reduce my peace, frankly. So I got to make a conscious trade-off that, yeah, okay, I'm gonna put on the part of my brain that allows me to imagine what's in your head, so that I can be like, yeah, oh, you know what? I'm so sorry that happened to you. That guy was a prick to you. God, I can't believe he was so horrible to you, right? Even though in my own mind, I might be thinking, well, there's 2 sides to both stories. Doesn't seem like he was such a bad guy, right? But my job is to validate your story as a friend, right? Mm-hmm. And so I've got to kind of put that network back in play in order to be able to play that role for you as a friend. And I've got to decide, how much peace am I really willing to trade off? To do that, to maintain that friendship. What level of friendship am I willing to maintain? Can I steer you a little bit more into this side, so I don't have to trade that off as much. Can we let's maybe have a hobby where we don't talk about our stuff. So maybe we'll just go like, hunting or something together, right? Or something like that where it's quiet. I don't have to like listen to your stories all the time, yet we can still be awesome friends, or whatever it is, right? And so I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, there was a lot of good stuff in what you just said there. Like you were talking about the sounds of the fan at my jiu-jitsu class, a traditional Japanese style. So I started there when I was 18, and after being there for a while, like every once in a while, I'd been going there for a long time, but every once in a while, after the meditation, the teacher would ask, and he started teaching in Indianapolis in 1967. So he's however old he is, like 70s, whatever now. And he's from Korea, but he teaches just Japanese style stuff. And he'd like look to the white belts, the newest people, like, did you hear the clock? And they're like, no. They don't even know what he's talking about. He'd go to the yellow belts. Did you hear the clock? They don't know what he was talking about. And then I remember I was a green belt at the time, and he gets to me, did you hear the clock? And I said, yes. And then on from there, and he's like, because like before that, like the white belt, so I've been going there, say a year or so. And then I get a year of meditation, and then I could hear the clock. But he was talking about how if you hear the clock the whole time, then it's like you're going crazy. But it's just like you're there. Oh, there's the clock. And then you're back to your posture. And then he would say, like, don't tell yourself a story. So it's like real, like traditional Zen meditation. Like, don't tell yourself a story. Just concentrate your posture, all this. And then he would tell the story sometimes of like when he was going through his divorce, he would sit down to meditate, and there's his ex-wife, and he'd be like, oh, cussing her, and oh, God. And then, sit down to meditate again the next day. There she is. Next day, there she is.
Totally, right.
But then after a while, you're sitting there, you're controlling your posture. You're not having a physical reaction. So then however long goes by, he sees her at the store, and he smiles at her. And he said she wasn't smiling.
Which stuns her, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So he said that, he was able to smile at her, but she was not smiling. And so that really stuck with me because, you learn how to be like, you just cut that story off. And, there's some stuff that have happened like with me, like with my kids and their mom and like this stuff so sometimes I start telling myself a story. I don't have all this stuff mastered yet, but sometimes I hit play on that story and I'm like, start getting frustrated and it's like I'm traveling back in time to when it happened again And, I was leading up to something I was going to ask you. Oh, so I was able to like see through this style of meditation. It's like, okay, like at first it's like, okay, well, meditation, what can it do? Well, it can like lower your heart rate, calm you down, these like things. Yeah, right. Well, try it. Okay. A month later it works. Okay. So you've told me that step one and that works. Well, you're talking about like, there's like these 10 steps, say, I'm just making up a number. Mm-hmm. So step one, you were right. Step two, you were right. Okay. I studied for another year. I just realized you were right about step 3 and 4 also. I couldn't see it from step 1, but now I'm at step 4 and I know that's true.
Totally.
But now I'm looking at like what you're talking about, like step 8 and 9 and 10. Like that sounds pretty crazy, man. And so I was wanting to ask you about, I'm getting to like the chakra system, and like I've had some experiences where I've had, I believe direct experiences of some chakras, like I'll call it like a dream state. I wasn't really asleep, but I wasn't really awake. I saw the Sahasrara chakra, the crown chakra, and I just like saw it, and it looked kind of like a brain, sort of, kind of, and it was like greenish, purplish, and it was just like changing all the time. It didn't stay the same for like 1 second. It was just like this, and it was it only happened once like that. And then there's like a couple other little things that I've had happen, but I haven't seen it proven yet. in myself that typical 1 through 7 chakra is true. But behind me, that's, a symbol for the heart chakra. So it's like, there it is. It's like, what's your views on the chakra system? Like, is there like the psychological benefit of these levels? So like, or is there some way to like scientifically prove them, or like just what's your?
That's a good question. It hasn't come up much in our work, but I can give you a little bit that I know from outside that. And it's that there was a lady that you can look up named Valerie Hunt, who was at UCLA. And she collaborated with, I think she was like in the physiology department or something like that. And she collaborated with the electrical engineering, I think, department, and maybe some other departments there. And they built her a camera that she swore could see the chakras. And so, this is like not some fringe person floating around out there. Like, this was back in VHS tape days. For anybody that remembers that, there might be people listening that are like, what's a VHS tape? So this was like a long time ago now. But, there are indications of things like that. And there's another thing that you can search for. You can search for like the acupuncture meridian stuff. There's been some really interesting research done. People always will take like an ohm meter or something like that, and they'll say like, oh, well, there's a different electrical resistance or something at those points. Okay, maybe, I don't know. But there was a much fancier study that was done. You can look up the Society for Scientific Exploration, and they had a conference and they recorded the talk, and they actually did some I think it was RF. I think it was like radio frequency analysis, and it was fascinating because they thought that using this RF sensing device, they were able to visualize basically the chakra, not the chakras, but the nadis that go along with the chakras, right? The acupuncture points. It's all part of the same system, essentially, which is why I'm talking about it. And when they would stimulate an acupuncture point, they would see like the other points up the arm, for instance, also like having an effect, which is what acupuncturists say happens. Mm-hmm. But, it's like, where's the evidence for that? I mean, it seems like this imaginary system or, whatever else. And so there actually have been some kind of fringe I can't remember where that was done. It might've been Baylor or it was at some university, some medical system. And so there are like these little clues to this inside the scientific world where people have claimed, credible people have claimed to have actually sort of made advancements on, measuring some of this kind of stuff. And then a little bit further afield, you have stuff like the BioWell and the Russian work on Kirlian photography and stuff like that. Many years ago when I was working in TV, a friend of mine and I used to like to build weird stuff. And while building this Kirlian camera, I don't know if you know what it is or not, but you basically put a very high amount of voltage through an object. And so in this case, they're using your fingertips. But you could do anything, like you could do a leaf or you could do a quarter. I mean, there's really nothing you can't do. And they all come up with sort of different pictures. They would, at the time, it went on to actual film. Now it's all done digitally. And so there's a guy who's kind of like the main guy for this in Russia. It all sort of started in Russia. Hence the word Kirlian, it's like a Russian name. And they claim that that they can tell all sorts of things about that energy system, about the chakra system and the acupuncture system and whatever. It shows up like right there in their reports from this system. And it's easy to want to dismiss stuff like this, but these are really hardworking, sincere people with a phenomenal amount of education and skill, who, when they're doing other things, right, when they're making like other medical devices or, when they're doing other sort of more mainstream advances, people aren't like, oh, well, that's weird. That guy's doing weird stuff. They're like, oh, thank you for inventing that, right? Mm-hmm. And then they do this other thing on the side that sounds a little weird to people. And so they sort of are like, oh, that's a weird thing, or, well, how come the other thing isn't a weird thing, right? I mean, it's like the same skill set that is allowing them to, use science and engineering to get to something. And how come like one of their things is credible, but the other thing isn't credible? So I think, all of these things need a lot more evidence behind them from my perspective, from a scientific perspective. But I also think we have to keep an open mind about it. That there have been some really serious, brilliant people who have looked at these and worked in these directions and who have made claims that deserve to be tested and replicated and stuff like that. You know?
Yeah. Several years ago, my girlfriend at the time and I went to have our pictures taken. I don't think it was exactly the Curlian, but when she got in front of the camera and I could see on the computer, and you put your hands on the sensors,
right.
Hers was like yellow and green. She was a yoga teacher. And it was just this flowing yellow and green. It was changing constantly. And so it took the picture. And so I was telling her, if it would have taken the picture a second before, it would have looked different.
Right.
And then it's my turn, and I go up in front of it, and it was intense red is the name of it. And she said it was intense red. That was like what the printout said and everything. And it didn't change the whole time.
Wow.
So it was like, something's different. And then we had the psychic, quote unquote, like maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. I'm very open to psychic things happening. But if somebody tells me they're a psychic and for $80 I don't know.
Right.
I believe in almost anything, and I'm also like skeptical too.
Right.
But he was like basically telling me I needed to chill out, and I'm pretty relaxed, but I do have like an intense side. I like martial arts. I like hard sparring. I like getting in there, and I'm also just like mellow and cool. But like there was like some difference for sure when she gets up there and it's yellow and green and all flowy, and then I go up there and it's intense red. Everything is just, so it was like
yeah, for sure. I've always wondered what those measure, because you put your hands on those metal plates.
Yeah.
And so they could be measuring like galvanic skin response from different parts of your, hand. I mean, when you look at the plates, usually they have like little different segments on them. And so they're clearly like able to see like a difference from here to here to here to here or something, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I wonder about those too. And then I was asking a guy that made those cameras one time. He wouldn't tell me like how they work, but I was asking him about the camera, and he said the camera was a scanner, which I thought was interesting. And so I was just like, I have no idea what's going on there, but I'm sort of curious about those two.
Yeah. And it's like, you could start talking about science stuff, and you could lie to me and I would have no idea. You could lose me and tell me some story, and I'd be like, oh, wow, really? That's cool. Like, I quit using a microwave because I heard the science behind using microwaves. It's like doing these terrible things to the food. Makes sense to me. And then I saw Neil deGrasse Tyson on Joe Rogan, and he asked him about it, and he's like, yeah, that's not true. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to, I can change my mind. So for now, I'll agree with whatever Neil deGrasse Tyson says, because when somebody is talking that not quite science, they can fool me. But he's like, yeah, that's not true at all. Here's what's really happening. So it's like, okay, well, I believe him. And I don't think he's part of like this big microwave conspiracy,
right?
Trying to take over the world. So it's like this.
That's where his money really comes from.
Yeah,
it's all from GE making microwave claims.
That takes me to like one of the next things I was going to ask you about is like you also had like the Reiki,
Yeah, nobody ever asked me about that stuff anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, that was listed on your website, and it looked like there was. I read through it, but I didn't like do like click to get it all. It was like there was like a good amount of stuff that people can get for free, and you were doing this stuff from like the early days, and then it's changed in all these different kinds. Yeah, and that was another one that it's like where I can believe it. I've had some pretty wild experiences myself but then I also have a hard time believing that you could go to this weekend workshop and then you could just like wave at my elbow and my elbow, oh, that's so much better.
Right.
So can you like, what's up with Reiki? basically.
That's a great question. I don't do it too much. I don't do it professionally or publicly or whatever, like I did in the early 90s. But I'm happy to talk about it and my experience with it, when, so in the early 90s, my mom got cancer and I was working in television. I was doing sports broadcasting primarily. And I was on kind of some of the really elite crews for sports broadcasting. And I was very young at the time. So I was in like my late teens, early 20s. And I was really just sort of an arrogant asshole. Just a pompous, arrogant asshole. Like, oh, look at how awesome I am. I'm on all of these elite crews and I'm doing TV stuff. Look how cool I am. And I was really emotionally immature. And so I was not really able to handle my mom's illness. I just was not emotionally mature enough to deal with the idea of my mom having cancer or potentially dying or whatever else. And so what I did is I kind of went into problem solving mode. And I was just looking for anything that I could get any empowerment from that might be able to turn that situation around. And it just so happened that this lady came through town teaching Reiki, which I didn't know much about. And I decided to take a workshop, decided to take the workshop. And it was really remarkable because they do these attunements, like these empowerments, right? They call them attunements, and they're like an initiation kind of. And when she initiated me, now this can all just be, your mind making up placebo crap, right? So I don't certainly rule that out. But when she initiated me, it was like a light switch turned on, and like all of a sudden I could feel like this feeling of electricity in my hands. And if I focus on it right now, it's still there all these years later. You block out stuff like that after a while, right? Like, I don't know if you know how, if you think about how senses work, but like if I were to put a really complicated pattern on a contact lens and you put it in your eye, you'd see it for like 10 seconds or something. And then your brain would just totally screen it out. Because your senses are always like looking for what's new, looking for new threats, looking for whatever else, right? Stuff that's been there for a while, it just sort of tunes it out. Our eyes have to move back and forth really rapidly so that we're constantly seeing changes. If you could just like still your eyes, like everything would just sort of go away that was stationary or whatever, if you were, if you had a fixed head and stuff. And so, I don't rule out these possibilities, but it was a very pronounced change. And it just so happens that a friend of mine now passed away, who is a quite well-known holistic medical doctor, also took the class. And he was my partner. He just got assigned sort of randomly as my partner. And so I had like this really well-known holistic MD who was like my partner in this class, and he's experiencing stuff too. And when I'm working on him, he's telling me that my hands are so hot that it's uncomfortable. And he's asking, like, can you do something like to turn it down? Which was, I put my hands on a lot of people before that, right? Nobody was ever like, oh, hey, you're burning me. Can you stop that? So that seemed like a new phenomenon. And then the teacher was like, oh, sure, you can just intend that it become tingling or something instead of so much heat, which all sounds crazy, right, on the surface. But that worked. Sure enough, it switched from heat to tingling from my own sensation. And the heat kind of tampened down for him. It was more tolerable or whatnot. And so then a friend of mine who had a hairdresser, and her hairdresser had fallen and shattered her wrist. And, hairdressers generally are not rich. And so every day that she couldn't cut hair, was, a really significant impact on her life. And so that her shattered wrist was so bad that they were going to have to operate, and she was going to be out for like 3 months or something. And that was like, starving time after a couple of weeks kind of thing, right? It was a really big deal. And so this friend was like, hey, do you think you could you just went to this Reiki class. She also knew the doctor. And so she's like, the doctor said, like, your hands were really hot. Like, do you think maybe you could help my hairdresser? And so I worked on the hairdresser, and I did what you were supposed to do back then, sort of the orthodox rules, where you would do Reiki 3 days in a row on somebody, and you would follow all these hand positions and stuff. I don't really do it that way anymore. But I was following the rules because I was brand new back then, right? Mm-hmm. And so I worked on her for 3 days, and she felt a change in her wrist for sure. And there was one moment where she really just felt like a really significant something happened, right? And it was right before, it was right in the session. Literally, I was finishing with her, and then she was like driving to get her pre-op x-ray the last day that I was working on her. There was only a few days before surgery, so I used all 3 of those days. And when they did the pre-op x-ray, her wrist was perfect. Like her wrist had never been injured. It looked like a perfect wrist, right? And the doctor didn't believe it. Like he's thinking there's a mix up with the x-rays, or like something is clearly wrong here. And so he asked her, what did you do? And she said, well, I've been praying. And he was just like, she said he just kind of rolled his eyes, you know. I was like, okay. But, you know, he refused to take the cast off her. That was the pre-op sort of cast or whatever, because he was worried about malpractice and he wanted her to come back and stuff. And so she just went home and she took her Dremel and she Dremeled her cast off and she went back to work and she never looked back. Wow. And that made a powerful impact on me, right? Like, how can you have something like that happen and not be like, holy crap, what just happened here, right? I mean, I went and looked up the placebo research and the nocebo research, and, you know, like bones generally do not reform on placebo, right? Like you cannot feel pain, you know, you can get poison ivy when you're, you know, when somebody's rubbing a fake plant on you, telling you it's poison ivy and you're blindfolded, like all kinds of things can happen in the placebo world. But generally a shattered wrist reforming and looking perfect is not one of those things that's covered by the placebo research, right? Yeah. And so that made a huge impact on me. And I actually, I then had a whole other series of things that I worked on for people, really bad things that in one case, for instance, somebody that was dying in the hospital and they were literally going to die that night. And then by the morning they were fine. And, you know, the doctors had no explanation for it. By this point, I knew to tell the person when the doctor asked, tell them you prayed about it. Right? That's like the right answer. Because I wasn't supposed to be there. You know, I was just supposed to be a friend there visiting. I wasn't supposed to be doing anything. I didn't want to get in trouble for practicing medicine without a license or anything like that. Right. Mm-hmm. And so this made a profound impact on me. And I made a decision actually that I was making a lot of money in television. You know, I was doing good in TV, working on these TV crews. It was union, and it was highly paid union. And so it was like an awesome gig. But my friends were like still either, you know, just they had normal jobs or they were going to college and they were broke or, you know, whatever, because I had just come out of high school, really. And I was thinking about them, and I was thinking about the fact that they really could have not afforded to go through that class. Like Reiki cost a lot of money to learn back then. Now it's a lot cheaper, in part because of some stuff that I did to make it cheaper. And so I was just sort of thinking, gosh, you know, whatever this is, this seems to work. My Christian family had issues with it. You know, it wasn't like Christian healing or whatever. And so I had some belief system stuff to overcome with friends and family and things like that. But it worked. And, you know, at the end of the day, like if you're sick and you want to get better and somebody's there that can make you better, like you'll, you know, look the other way on your biblical beliefs for a little while and then get better and then go back and repent or whatever. Right. So, so I wound up leaving television for a little while. And going around and studying with a lot of sort of the original Reiki people that were around back then. It was fairly new. It was new enough that there were only a few splinters of it at that point, and you could basically learn them all. And then I put together a meta class that had all of that in it. And I traveled around and I had these classes where I would retrain teachers in different areas. So like maybe they knew one system, but they didn't know the other versions of it. And I really just used that to drive the price of Reiki down as best I could. So instead of it costing thousands of dollars or even $10,000 to learn the teacher level, I would just, you know, drop into town and do it for like $350 or something, which paid for all the expenses and everything. And I would have done it for free, but nobody would take the class when I did it for free because they don't value, you know, people don't value stuff when it's free. So I started by just trying to give it away. Mm-hmm. And nobody, you know, people were like, oh, that can't be real. Who gives that away? That costs $10,000, right? Mm-hmm. And so I just started raising the price little by little until I got to the point where there was a full room of people. And that wound up being, I think, about $350 if I remember back all those years. And so anyway, what you see on the web now, I recorded one of those sort of meta master training workshops and on VHS tape, the hardback. And I not long ago went back and digitized that and put it up on YouTube. I sold it for a long time as like a DVD set and stuff like that because I wanted it out there. But YouTube wasn't around then. There was no way to get stuff out there back then. You basically had to sell stuff that people could order and watch on their DVD players and stuff. But once YouTube became available and it was possible to put video on the web and stuff, I just stopped doing that. And then I just copied everything over to YouTube and just put it out so that anybody can watch it. And I'd long since been putting out the books for free. You can go to freereikibook.com and download the books for free. You can also get them in a Kindle version if you really want them. And those books, when I wrote them in the early 90s, they were like landmark books. A lot of people used those books. They were foundational books. I only wrote those books because there weren't good books for me to use in my own classes. I didn't want to write any books. But they wound up being the first books that I ever wrote. And I wrote them so that I had something to hand out when I was teaching Reiki. And so I've just basically left them out there. I mean, hopefully they don't say anything too crazy. Probably they do. I don't know. It was a 3-decade-old version of myself. Who knows what I was into back then or what I was like. So I have had a very profound experience with Reiki, and I've seen lots of people be healed under my own hands in what seem like highly miraculous ways, really all around the world at this point. Ordinary people, famous people, you name it. And so I did that for a couple of years until the price was until I'd sort of seeded all these other masters. And, once you've taken a master class for $350, it's kind of hard to go back to charging $10,000, right? And so it just sort of drove the price down around. I would do a regional class like the Denver, the class that's on the web was done in between Denver and Colorado Springs. And it was designed to sort of hit that regional area. So people drove down from Denver, they drove up to Colorado Springs, and the room was just packed, And so, yeah. So, I don't know what to make of it. And if you look at the scientific research on it, it's spotty. I mean, if I talk as a scientist, you have to kind of say, I don't know, it looks like Reiki might not work. Yeah. But then if you talk from your own personal lived experience of it, I mean, I've just seen so many, what seem frankly just like miraculous things happen under my own hands that it's impossible for me to say that it doesn't work. It makes me think there's probably better scientific designs out there to get at it, or something like that, So it's interesting.
Have you seen like where there's a type of people, like you're talking about, like the level 1, 2, and 3 people that get better results as a practitioner? I mean, I guess to even like get into it, you would have to have some kind of...
I don't think it matters. You can just have Reiki 1 and you can have that powerful effect like I did on that wrist. That was a combined Reiki 1 and 2 class that I took. And I know that I could have just had any empowerment, from, her name is Jeannie Greening. She's probably still out there teaching. She was last I checked. Hopefully she hasn't passed away. She's getting probably up there at this point. But she's just a marvelous teacher. I got lucky, she wound up being one of the famous teachers at the time. And I had no idea, it was just a random class for me. So yeah, no, I don't think it matters. I really don't think it matters. I think once you're tapped in, you're tapped in. And you get the third level, take the third level if you want, because it'll help you to teach it. The third level is the teaching level. The second level adds quote unquote mental emotional healing. And the first level is just sort of supposed to be physical level healing. But I think just the first level, even if that's all you get, and it's hard to get that. Almost everybody combines level 1 and 2. But I think even just the first level is plenty, really. And I think, to my mind, this is something like every mom should have to get rid of their kid's headache. And I mean, it's having said that, I think one of the mistakes that I made involving Reiki and driving the price down, or being one of the people that was instrumental in that, is now it's fractioned, and there's so many different kinds of Reiki out there. It's really hard to tell if you're getting the real thing. If you're, I think you can probably go to a class and maybe get very little compared to what you could, in the 80s and 90s, early 90s. out of a Reiki class. I do think that it has sort of watered it down in some ways. You probably have to be much more careful about who you learn it from than I did. I could just take this random person that I'd never heard of that was running through town. I would not do that today. I would really look to see like how powerful a healer is this person. Do they have these kinds of stories? Can you meet the person that had the shattered wrist or whatever, right? And all of that. And so I think it's a little bit of a different time today. I think that's part of the reason the studies aren't more successful. Because even if I were to think about putting together a Reiki study today, I wouldn't know where to start in terms of finding like the right masters to, or practitioners to do it. That would take probably way more research than actually designing and running the experiment.
Yeah, it's fascinating what these bodies that we have them since we're born, and we just learn that they can do all kinds of tricks, and we just like get to be 30, 40 years old still learning. Wow, I didn't know that. 50, it's like there's so much. I guess it's one of the cool things is there's so much mystery.
Yeah,
and
mystery.
Like if something works, then that's enough proof. And like I guess a lot of times the science is behind the reality. It's like it's kind of fascinating.
The science is definitely behind the reality of this. I mean, I have no doubt that there was some sort of, the science is behind the reality of the placebo effect, right? Like, what the heck is it that allows you to take somebody who's got, who's deathly allergic to poison ivy and blindfold them and rub a branch with some leaves on it on their arm and tell them that it's poison ivy and have them break out in poison ivy? Like, what in the world is going on that can produce that, right? So yeah, the science is behind all this stuff. The world is still so totally mysterious. It's funny, when you get a PhD, one of the things they tell you is that the bar to get a PhD, the difference between a master's degree and a PhD, is the creation of some sort of substantial new human knowledge, right? And so at a master's level, you basically learn how to do studies, you can conduct studies, and you can do sort of routine studies and all of that. But like to get a PhD, you basically have to make some sort of substantial contribution that's new to human knowledge. That's the bar to become Dr. such and such or whatever, right? And it's so funny because, when you're in an academic environment, so oftentimes students will come into your programs and they'll be like, it seems like everything's already been done, but, I've got to like find some new massive contribution to human knowledge. And it's funny because from your like more seasoned perspective, you're like, we know practically nothing. Right? Yeah. So like our perspective is like more midterm or senior scientists or whatever are like, the world's a freaking wide open mystery. Like there's so many different things that you could do for your dissertation, for your PhD, But people come in are like, oh, it's all nailed, because they've come through these other levels of the education system that have like put them in these little boxes that don't seem like there's anything new outside of it, for them to learn. And you've always got to kind of take a chisel and break them out of that box. It's funny. It's funny,
Yeah.
Because it's all just a mystery. Like we know nothing.
Yeah.
We start talking about the brain and neuroscience. Oh my God, we know nothing.
Yeah. I think it was like the guy that worked at the patent office when Edison was doing all of his thing. And then it got to a point where back then he was like, anything that could be invented already has been.
Right.
And this is like, what's that, 130 years ago or something? Well, not that long ago.
Or there was a guy that was the head of the Royal Society in Britain, which was the scientific society of its day around the turn of the century. And he's basically like, we've got it all figured. He has some phrase like, science has it all figured up. We're mostly just mopping up the little details. And of course, they knew nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I remember watching something like there was a kid who had autism. And so he was going to like a regular school and not getting anything. He didn't speak. And then so his mom was like, well, I'm just going to start teaching him at home. And he's not communicating, but he liked to look at glasses of water. And so she's like, okay, if that's what he likes, if he likes looking at glasses of water, I'm going to fill up a bunch of glasses of water, and he would just stare at the glasses of water. If that's what he likes, hey, this is his life. This makes him happy. Well, then like she ends up teaching like another kid with autism. Like they're, she's like running this like school out of her garage where there's like another kid and another kid. Well, and then like I forget what exactly happened where like he did something to like she was out like looking at the stars with him or something, and he like motioned that he wanted something to eat or something like that, and that was like I forget exactly what happened, but some small thing was like this major thing to her because he never would communicate. Well, he went on to like become a physicist. So when he was staring at those glasses of water, there was stuff going on. He couldn't communicate. He couldn't have a conversation, but he was able to begin speaking and went on to become a physicist. And then so he was like teaching his brother, who I don't think his brother had autism, but he was teaching his brother like how to think differently. But this guy with autism that started off staring at glasses of water was basically like anybody can solve a problem. So like that's kind of the way you need to think about like when you're going through school. He's like, find a problem and solve it. I mean, anybody can solve some kind of a problem. And I forget what reminded me of that. What triggered me? Oh, you were just talking about how there's all these things to solve and all these things to do, like for their PhD programs. So it's
totally,
yeah, the human mind, and just like him, you would think, you'd see him staring at glasses of water and feel sorry for him, but you have no idea what he can see. It's like it's amazing.
Totally.
See what else I want to ask you about. We've been going for a while. I don't want to take up all your time. There was let's see, what was I? There was like when are you like, I think I saw a couple pictures on your website where people have like the sensors on their head.
Yeah.
Okay. And so are you measuring like brain waves during their meditation, or you're measuring the brain waves during their whatever practice they have? Like,
yeah, we have historically, and we do different stuff with that equipment. That's EEG equipment. And, we've done so many different things with it over time. Typically with that type of equipment, you design experiments. And so you design interventions and you test like reaction times, or, you test responses to emotional pictures, or you test, how long someone can tolerate and what's going on in their brain while you've got their arm in ice water, or there's all sorts of different sort of experimental methods. And so we do measure people while they're meditating. We'll measure people before and after for baselines as well. But we also have protocols like these sort of more experimental protocols that are designed to test their cognition in different ways, or their emotionality, or their reactions, or, things like that. And so it's a whole gamut of different stuff that we deal with that. But yeah, we absolutely do.
Yeah, I was looking at I saw an ad, and I don't know what they were called. It was like some headband. I don't know if it was called Muse.
Probably the Muse. Was it the Muse headband from Interaxon? Yeah.
Yeah. So I was like looking at it because there was like two different versions of it, and I was like, I wonder, so is that like real? Is that accurate?
That's a great product. We really like the Muse. From the other side of the thing that I'm involved with is the Transformative Technology movement, which is basically the technology for well-being space. And so we're familiar with all of these different products, and generally speaking, the people behind them are good friends of ours and stuff. And so that's absolutely the case with Muse. We like Muse a lot. Muse is a venture-backed company, which means that they've had millions and millions and millions of dollars in order to really get it right. And they have a brilliant design for their headset that fits all kinds of different heads, which is a very, very hard problem for something like that. They have all kinds of fancy math that adapts the thing to you and to your brain waves, which is amazing. And they have a really super simple application. Like it's like beach waves and wind. Like, when your mind is more noisy, you hear more wind. And when it's relaxed, the wind calms down. And, you hear birds chirping when you're doing really well. And, count the number of birds that you get. And I mean, it's just so elegant and so simple. They've done a really, really good job with those products and with innovating those products. They're adding in new sensors and stuff over time. And they had a version that went with eyeglasses, so you didn't have to wear this weird looking headband. It could be part of your eyeglasses. And very innovative company doing really neat stuff. Yeah, I'd totally try it if I were you. It's cool.
Yeah. So you've actually used it yourself?
Oh yeah, for sure. We got a bunch of them.
Yeah. I was close to getting one, and I was like, I sent the link to a couple buddies of mine that teach yoga. They meditate, and I was like, 'cause I think sometimes we know meditation works, but how much are we pretending that, how much of what is going how much of what we're doing is just like make believe, and I'm reaching this state and maybe not. So if you can have something on these accurate measurements, like, okay, I am hitting this.
And there are some other ones, a lot of smartphones these days have the capability to tell you your stress level, which is, usually done off a heart rate sensor of some kind. And so like I have a Samsung smartphone, and it's got a heart sensor on the back of it. And it's able to basically give me a very accurate reading of what's called heart rate variability. And heart rate variability, probably from your athletic side, because that's very, very popular. And, from an athletic standpoint, it gives you body recovery after exercise and sports and stuff like that. On the well-being side, though, it's also really, really useful. And so, people might have it just built in, sitting right in their pocket. But for people that don't, there's all kinds of devices like HeartMath is probably the most famous device for this. And that's another really good way to sort of quantify and measure your relaxation and your meditation space. In that case, it's a breath-based meditation. You follow a little breath tracker on the screen to breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out at a very certain pace. And you can see the impact that it has on your physiology, on your heart rate variability. Another one is Spire. Spire is a breath tracker. And they have different versions of it. Now they have a kind that you can basically wash. You can stick it to your underwear or the inside of your pants or whatever else, and they can go through the wash with it and stuff. It used to be, they still have a kind that you kind of clip onto your belt, which is another way to do it. And it tracks your breathing. And so you can use that, obviously, from a meditation standpoint. The guy who's behind that is a guy named Nima, who had a lab at Stanford, where he researched this as part of his PhD. So he's totally into meditation, and that was a big influence on why he did it. But it also, you wear this thing over the course of the day, and it alerts you like when you're stressed out, when your breathing is stressed out. And it's like an intervention, basically, like, hey, this could be a good time to sort of meditate. Like your physiology is going through something that does not look like calm, right?
So it'll just like, sorry. So like you're wearing this thing, and then if you start getting frustrated or something, it'll beep or it'll buzz or something like,
yeah, it'll usually activate on your phone, to like send you a message on your phone or, stuff like that. It's pretty cool. And so there's a lot of these types of technologies that are out there. There's an app, I think, that's still out there from a company called Beyond Verbal called Moody's, which is free to download. And it can actually read the mood of your voice. And so, if you think you're relaxed, you can test it.
What's the name of it again?
Moody's, Moodies, from a company called Beyond Verbal, who's a phenomenal company. These people can measure like Parkinson's 5 years before it shows up off of your voice.
Whoa.
And stuff like that. It's incredible how much information is contained in something like your voice. And so there's all sorts of fun little products like this, that are out there. But Muse, these are all the best of class ones, Muse, Spire, HeartMath. I mean, these are really best of class products.
Yeah, I was wanting to like,
another one
I've been familiar with heart rate variability, but that was something that I was wanting to like, I've never like actually measured it on myself before, or, but that was something I was wanting to get into with like clients and stuff like,
yeah, totally.
But
For that, for an exercise situation, you may want to get a chest strap, like one of the polar chest straps or something like that. And then there are some really, really great apps. One of the things that you'll want to do from a fitness standpoint is you want to take what's called sort of a morning readiness reading. And so right when you wake up, right in the morning, you'll want to immediately do an HRV reading. And you'll just want to do that every day. And there's a lot of apps out there on the fitness side of the fence that can really tell you a lot about how you're really doing and how your body is really doing just from that morning HRV reading. Of course, like I said, athletes use it to test their recovery time and to test how quickly their body recovers from, intense activity and stuff as well. But that morning readiness thing is another important thing to know about.
Yeah, that's really cool. There's I try
the app for that, incidentally, is Elite HRV.
Elite HRV. Yeah, I'll check that out because I study what the trainers for the UFC fighters are doing, and so there's a lot of them, like these fighters. They're ready to go every day in the gym every day. They're ready to go, and now some of the smarter coaches are going like, I know you're feeling it, but your test came back that this is an easy day. We're just going to do some light pad work. We're just going to stretch out, relax, because science. I know you're ready to beat somebody up, but today's not the day. We'll see what
mentally you're in one spot, but your body is being measured in a different spot. Exactly.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't want to tie you up a lot longer. We've been going for almost 2 hours here. I could talk about this stuff with you all night. I'd love to have you on again. And
yeah, thanks. That'd be fun.
Yeah, I was like, is there anything we haven't covered? I mean, I'm not in a hurry. We don't have to stop right now. But is there anything we haven't covered that?
I should get some dinner. I haven't eaten much today, so that's probably not a bad idea. It's 7:00 where I am.
Yeah.
Not too much. Probably just where people can find more information. Like non-symbolic.org is where they can find our research, website on the fundamental well-being stuff. And the experiment is at finderscourse.com. And if you went through those steps and you're like, I might be in fundamental well-being, we have a couple of hours of videos they can watch on a website called explorerscourse.com. That really helps you to orient towards the things that are most important for you to know in that life. I have a new book coming out about all this called The Finders, probably be out by the time this podcast is live. And that really, really defines what this is and helps people really sort of understand what it is in a way that you can't do in a short interview or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then I would say on the transformative technology side of the fence, people that are interested in technology for well-being stuff, we have a fantastic resource website called the Transformative Technology 200. So if you go to transtech200, either .org or .com, I'm not really sure off the top of my head which it is. We've curated really sort of the best products in the technology for well-being space. It's not like the most totally user-friendly. There aren't affiliate links to click through to buy the stuff right away or whatever else, right? It really is just a listing of here's who matters. And then you can sort of mouse over them or click on them and find out why they matter, and what they're relevant to. And you can kind of sort them by category. So if you were just looking for the bio stuff or whatever, you could sort on that category, for instance, and then Muse would be there, for instance, and Heart Math and, people like that. I think that's a landscape that's kind of hard to find if you're just sort of randomly searching the web. And so that's just something that we do every year. Once a year, basically, we update that. And we bring it for journalists so that they know where to go look for stories, to do stories on these companies and stuff like that. And then we've got all kinds of videos people can watch for free on Transformative Technology. We have a conference that's in Silicon Valley every year. It's called ttconf.org is the website for that. And we videotaped, everybody who's ever spoken there. And so you can see the lady who runs Muse, for instance, and you can see her give a presentation about Muse. You can see the people from Heart Math. You can see them giving their presentation about Heart Math. We try to just provide resources like that, in the technology for well-being space. So there's all kinds of stuff out there.
Yeah, it's what a fascinating time to be able to prove these great claims that before you had to give your life to the master or whatever for
totally
decades, and then maybe find out that he's full of baloney or
yeah, exactly,
or real. Yeah, it's very cool. Well, thanks again for being on. It was
Well, thank you, Ryan. This was
really
really
cool.
great.
Yeah, again, I'd love to have you on again. And so I was
That'd be
wanting to
great.
like talk about your books. Yeah, like so many books, so much like stuff going on
I
that
know we can go in so many directions. It's all fun.
yeah, I wrote down like 10 things I didn't even, there was still a few of them I didn't even get to because it's just the way it goes. But well, I will stop the
There's
recording.
always next time.
Yep. Yeah, I'll stop the recording and I'll talk to you for a minute after we stop.
Sounds great.
All right. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.